The timeline of ancient Egypt spans 3,000 years from the time of its first king, Narmer, in 2950 BC, to the suicide of Queen Cleopatra in 30 BC. During that time and ever since, the history of ancient Egypt has fascinated and horrified in equal measure. The stories of the pharaohs and pyramids, mummies and sphinx, transport us to another world, rich and deadly, intoxicating, weird and powerful. A world of magic, of ancient curses, golden treasure and strange hieroglyphs, darkness and rebirth. It's a great story. In this first video we chart the formation and growth of ancient Egypt, from disparate cattle herders to the first pharaohs of a united nation state. In this period, we go from this to this. To us, this period is impossibly ancient. Cleopatra herself is much closer to us in time than she is to the building of the Great Pyramids. So our story begins around 5000 BC. Summer rains fall and create large areas of lush grassland, fed upon by roaming bands of nomadic tribes and their cattle. This is the period when the Nabta Playa megaliths are created, the so-called Egyptian Stonehenge, probably arranged to help predict the annual rainy season. But over time, the rains move south. Over centuries, the desert dries out, and by around 3600 BC, the early Egyptian nomads are forced to relocate to the Nile as permanent settlers. Here, Egyptian culture and society develops much the same as it does the world over for these first civilizations. Competition for resources and land forces innovations in agriculture, technology, and warfare. As the archaeological records show, groups coalesce into fortified towns surrounded by large defensive walls. Graves are filled with bodies bearing the scars and trauma of warfare. Eventually, by 2950 BC, the kings of this region claim ultimate victory over their rivals. Egypt itself is born. From the reign of Narmer onwards, Egyptian history is organized into discrete dynasties of kings or pharaohs. In total, there are about 33 dynasties, each comprising around 5 to 10 kings. Cleopatra belongs to the final dynasty of Egyptian kings, the so-called Ptolemaic period, itself encompassing around 16 pharaohs. The position of pharaoh was a complex one. Yes, the pharaoh was a god, but not only that, he embodied the very concept of existence. The pharaoh was all life, just as he was all death. In the person of the king lay the ancient Egyptians' understanding of reality. Take for instance those summer rains. They moved south, far south, and fell once a year upon the mountains of Ethiopia, washing down tributaries and streams to flood the entire length of the Nile, irrigating enormous swaths of land either side of the great river, at once flooding and destroying miles of habitat, and yet leaving behind vital nutrients and the moisture necessary to sustain crops and livestock. The Nile and its floods were the lifeblood of this burgeoning civilization. It was a cycle of destruction and rebirth that defined ancient Egyptian culture and religion. Flood and drought, creation and destruction, life and death. And it was the pharaoh, as a living god, that embodied this dual reality. He was the guarantor of one's very existence. To question the pharaoh's power was to challenge the very order of life itself. Thus, in early Egypt, we see the development of what are now standard symbols of centralized authority: the crown or headdress, for the Egyptians the taller the better, and a big stick or mace, clearly displaying for all the violent power of the king. It later evolves into a slightly more genteel golden scepter. As a nod to their cattle-herding roots, pharaohs were sometimes pictured with a simple shepherd's crook. In fact, Such was the association that the crook was duly adopted as the hieroglyph for ruler. These stone reliefs, coupled with the results of archaeological excavations, also provide evidence of the harsh realities of pharaonic rule. From the earliest kings, we have depictions of enemies slaughtered, their hands and genitals hacked off. There are grim reminders of the extent to which king worship was taken. Surrounding the tombs of the First Dynasty pharaohs, we find the remains of the king's retainers, servants who were strangled shortly after the king's death and buried alongside him, so that they could serve him in the afterlife. The tomb of the pharaoh Djeth, who died around 2900 BC, was surrounded by 318 subsidiary burials, servants, concubines, and his pet dogs. Indeed, the death of the pharaoh was a monumental event, and his tomb served not only as a symbol of his power and status on earth, but as a means by which he would be resurrected in the afterlife. Thus, as the power and status of Egypt's rulers multiplied throughout the early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods, roughly the first 800 years of pharaonic rule, so too did the need to display such power in increasingly elaborate tombs. Eventually, this righteous arms race produced some of the greatest monuments in all of human creation, the pyramids at Giza. They were built during 3 successive generations of the 4th dynasty, beginning during the reign of the pharaoh Khufu in 2945 BC, and it was for Khufu that the largest of the 3 pyramids of Giza was built. Standing around 481 feet tall and containing 2.3 million blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, the Great Pyramid would have been covered with brilliant white limestone upon completion and topped with a golden capstone. It would have shimmered in the light, a quite literally awesome spectacle. The workforce would have comprised something like 10,000 labourers, architects, managers, cooks, servants, blacksmiths and engineers, each divided into gangs of workers who gave themselves cool nicknames such as the King's Drunkards or the Really Great Gang of Workmen working on the building of the Pyramid of Khufu. And they were paid. They were not slaves. During the later dynasties of the Old Kingdom period, in the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, much smaller pyramids were built, as well as several open-air temples to the sun god Ra, who by this point had emerged as the preeminent deity replacing the falcon god Horus. The story here is of an overburdened bureaucracy, which, no doubt, had evolved to accommodate the gargantuan task of building the Great Pyramids, but by now had established an alternative power base, a genuine threat to the centralized power of the pharaoh. Some of the bureaucrats' titles are a little strange. Chief of the Secrets of the Bathroom and Head of the Palace Hairdressers are my personal favourites. And so there is a sense of decline as we come to the end of the first period. There is evidence from the 6th dynasty of multiple insurgencies from foreigners in Palestine to the north and Nubia to the south. A story from the reign of the boy pharaoh Pepi II, who seems to have been more interested in news of a dancing pygmy from Sudan than of actually governing, seems typical of the era. How ancient Egypt responds to this decline, including new threats posed by climate change, uncontrolled immigration, and the rise of foreign powers, is the subject of next week's video. Thanks for listening. If you like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell.